The night air in Manhattan was heavy with the smell of rain. Streets gleamed under the glow of street lamps, the pavement reflecting passing cars like fragments of broken glass. It was late, almost closing time at a quiet corner diner tucked between two towering office buildings. The place was nothing fancy. Red vinyl booths, chrome stools at the counter, a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. But it carried a kind of warmth that kept regulars coming back. The waitstaff knew the names of truck drivers who stopped by every night, and they kept extra pie on hand for tired nurses finishing long shifts. It wasn't a place for wealth or status, but for people who wanted to sit down, breathe, and not feel invisible. At a corner table by the window, a man sat alone, the kind of man who didn't belong here. He wore a suit that cost more than a month's rent in the neighborhood, though he had loosened his tie, maybe to look less out of place. His watch gleamed when the overhead lights caught it, gold flashing in the dim space. His face was handsome in a distant, worn-down way, but his eyes stayed cold, as though he was here only in body, his mind elsewhere. He had ordered nothing but coffee, and though the cup had long gone cold, he stayed, watching. To anyone passing by, he might have looked like a businessman stranded in the wrong part of town. But he wasn't here by accident. Across the diner, a young waitress moved between tables with practiced grace. Her apron was stained from hours of work, her ponytail pulled tight, her face flushed from rushing orders. She was the kind of woman most people overlooked, not because she lacked beauty, but because life had demanded she keep her head down. She smiled politely at customers, but it never reached her eyes. Every move she made carried a quiet exhaustion, the sort of heaviness that doesn't come from one long shift, but from years of care, roying too much alone. The bell above the door jingled, drawing her attention. A boy wheeled in slowly, his small hands clutching the wheels of a chair that seemed too big for him. He looked about 10, maybe a little older, his thin frame swallowed by a loose sweatshirt. His movements were stiff, unsteady, the kind of awkwardness that comes with a body that doesn't always obey. He didn't look around at the other diners. Instead, his eyes followed the waitress, and when she bent down to greet him, her voice softened, losing that sharp edge she used with impatient customers. She spoke to him gently, as if she understood him in a way others didn't. The man in the corner never stopped watching. His gaze locked on the boy, then on the waitress, studying every detail. Something in the way his jaw clenched betrayed more than casual interest. His hands tightened around the coffee cup, though he didn't drink. He looked like someone keeping himself from saying words that had been building in his throat all night. The boy struggled with his food when it arrived. His hands shook, the fork slipping from his grip. The waitress noticed before anyone else. Without hesitation, she slid into the booth beside him and began to cut his food into small pieces. She didn't rush, didn't act as though it was a burden. She steadied his trembling hand, helping him lift a bite to his mouth. The boy's shoulders relaxed, his frustration giving way to a quiet smile. And for the first time, the man in the corner blinked, as though something deep inside him cracked open. To the rest of the diner, it was nothing. A waitress is helping a disabled boy eat, a simple act of kindness in a world that often moves too fast to care. But in that corner, behind the eyes of the man in the suit, something darker stirred. This was no ordinary customer. He was a billionaire, a man used to commanding rooms filled with power, wealth, and fear. His empire stretched across cities, his influence seeping into places most people never saw. Yet here he sat, in a diner that smelled of burnt coffee and grease, watching his own son struggle to bring a fork to his lips. The world knew him as ruthless, untouchable. But inside this small booth, with the boy and the waitress, the walls of that identity began to tremble. On the surface, the picture looked harmless, a waitress feeding a child, a wealthy man observing. But under the hum of flickering lights, unspoken tensions began to build. The boy's mother wasn't there. She hadn't been for a long time. The billionaire father had built walls of control around his life, yet he couldn't control this one thing: the body of his only child betraying him day after day. And when he saw the boy smile at a stranger in a way he rarely smiled at him, something twisted deep in his chest. The waitress didn't notice. To her, this was just another night, another act of quiet kindness in a world that rarely gave any back. She had her own struggles: rent overdue, bills piling, dreams she no longer dared to chase. Helping the boy was instinct, nothing more. But the man saw it differently. To him, this woman was touching the part of his life that made him feel weakest. And in his world, weakness was something to bury, to silence, to control. As rain tapped against the diner windows, no one could know how much this moment would matter. A billionaire, his disabled son, and a waitress who thought kindness cost nothing. 3 lives brushing against each other in a quiet corner of the city, unaware that what happened in that booth would soon unravel into something none of them could escape. The days that followed blurred together, but the billionaire couldn't get the image out of his head. The sight of that waitress leaning close to his son, steadying his trembling hand, feeding him gently as though he mattered, burned into his mind. It unsettled him. He had seen his boy cared for by the best therapists, the most expensive private nurses, people who cost more than some families earned in a year. Yet none of them had managed to draw out that soft smile the waitress did in just a few minutes. He returned to the diner the next night, and the night after. He told himself it was for his son, that maybe the boy liked the food here, or that it gave him a sense of normal life. But deep down, he knew he was watching her. The waitress. He studied every move, every fleeting smile, every way she bent down to listen to a customer's story with patience she probably didn't feel. He began to measure the way his son responded to her compared to him, and the gap between them grew sharper in his mind. The boy started to look forward to these evenings. It showed in the way he leaned forward in his chair when they pulled up outside, his eyes scanning the diner for her face. It wasn't long before he asked about her when she wasn't around, his voice hesitant, halting, but eager in a way his father hadn't heard in years. The billionaire should have been grateful, but gratitude was a stranger to him. Instead, he felt jealousy creeping in. His own son, the one he had fought to protect and raise, seemed to give his affection so freely to a stranger, while barely acknowledging him. The waitress, meanwhile, had no idea of the storm she was walking into. She thought of the boy as she thought of many of her customers, with a soft spot for his struggles, maybe a little more kindness than usual, but nothing more. Her life outside the diner was too consuming to allow fantasies. Rent was late again. Her mother's health was declining back home. The bills piled higher than the tips she collected. She was drowning quietly, smiling through the waves so no one would notice. If she thought of the man in the suit at all, it was only to wonder what someone like him was doing in a place like this. But the man thought of her constantly. At first it was harmless enough. He told himself he admired her patience, her humanity. He convinced himself she was different from the women in his circles, the ones who wore masks of charm while calculating every move. Yet the admiration darkened quickly. He began to wonder why she smiled more at others than at him, why she seemed so free with her kindness, but gave him only the same polite treatment she gave to everyone else. In his world, attention was bought, power demanded respect, and affection was earned through control. Here, he had none of that. The cracks widened when the boy, one evening, blurted out that he wished the waitress could come home with them. His voice was quiet, shy, but his father heard it clear as thunder. The billionaire froze. He forced a smile, brushing it off in front of the waitress. But inside, something twisted violently. He had built empires, commanded armies of lawyers and investors, and crushed rivals without blinking. Yet in that single sentence, his son revealed what he truly wanted. And it wasn't him. From that moment, The man's visits to the diner changed. He still came with his son, but his eyes were harder, his questions sharper. He began to probe the waitress about her life, where she lived, if she had family, and if she was in school. His voice carried the weight of casual conversation, but there was a current beneath it, a pull she couldn't quite name. She laughed nervously, deflecting when she could, but something in his gaze unsettled her. Outside the diner, pressures weighed heavily on all of them. The billionaire's empire was in quiet trouble. Lawsuits hovered on the edge of exposure, business rivals circled like vultures, and whispers of corruption followed him in every boardroom. He could handle those battles, he always had. But what he couldn't handle was the hollow look in his son's eyes when he sat in their vast, empty penthouse. The boy rarely spoke, rarely laughed, except when they went to that diner. That diner. That waitress. She had become a threat, not because of what she did, but because of what she represented. A life where his son might love someone else more than him. The waitress had her own secrets. She had left school early, not by choice but by necessity, forced into work when her father vanished with debts that still haunted her. She carried shame quietly, letting people believe she was just another girl who never had ambition, when in truth, ambition had been stolen from her. She lived paycheck to paycheck, fearing eviction, her past mistakes dragging at her heels. She told no one these things, but the billionaire had ways of knowing. He had people dig into her life, and the more he learned, the more dangerous his interest became. He began to manipulate small moments. A larger tip than usual slid across the counter with a look that lingered too long. A comment about her potential, spoken like a promise of rescue. Subtle digs about the customers around her, painting himself as the only one who saw her worth. At first, she brushed it off. Wealthy men with too much time were nothing new. But his persistence unnerved her. The lines between kindness and possession blurred with every encounter. The boy, caught in the middle, didn't see these undercurrents. To him, the waitress was a light, someone who made him feel seen in a world where he often felt invisible. He clung to her attention, not realizing how it deepened the rift between his parents long ago, and now between himself and his father. Every smile she gave him was another shadow cast over the billionaire's pride. The tension finally bled into confrontation one rainy night. The diner was nearly empty, the waitress wiping down tables as the boy picked at his plate. The billionaire leaned across the booth, his voice low but sharp as he asked why she worked here when she could be doing something better. She froze, sensing the edge in his tone. He didn't sound like a man curious about her future. He sounded like a man staking a claim. His son's eyes darted between them, confusion clouding his face. The waitress tried to laugh it off, but the man pressed harder. He asked about her rent, her family, and even her love life. She felt stripped bare under his gaze, as if her secrets were no longer hers. When she excused herself to the kitchen, her hands shook as she steadied herself on the counter. Something was wrong, and she knew it now. And yet, she couldn't simply walk away. She needed the job, needed the money, needed to keep her life afloat. So she stayed, telling herself it was harmless, that men like him came and went. But each night, his presence loomed larger, his eyes sharper, his tone colder. The boy smiled at her, as though she were family, and his father watched with a jealousy that simmered like fire beneath glass. The fragile world of that diner began to warp. What started as kindness became obsession. What began as admiration became control. And while the city outside moved on, unaware, the small triangle inside those red vinyl walls hurtled toward a breaking point. The night of the crime began like any other. Rain slid down the diner windows, streaking the glass in thin rivers, and thunder rumbled far in the distance. Inside, the air smelled of fried onions and burnt coffee, the usual background scent that clung to the walls. The red vinyl booths reflected the dim light, the jukebox buzzed faintly with static, and a few tired customers kept to themselves, sipping coffee or staring at their phones. Nothing about the place suggested that anything extraordinary was about to happen. Yet for the three people sitting in that corner booth, the billionaire, his son, and the waitress, the world was about to shatter. The boy had insisted on coming again that night. His small voice had carried a rare stubbornness when he told his father he wanted to see her, the waitress. The billionaire had given in, though his jaw tightened at the thought. His son's face lit up when she appeared, carrying plates with her usual hurried grace. She smiled at the boy, bending down to greet him warmly. For a moment he forgot the weight of his body, the stiffness of his limbs, and laughed softly at something she said. That sound, a sound the billionaire hadn't heard in so long, struck him like a blade. He sat there watching, his coffee untouched, his heart pounding too fast. His thoughts twisted darker with every passing second. To him, this wasn't kindness anymore. This was an intrusion. This woman, this waitress, had taken something from him. His son's affection, his trust, his smile. All the things that should have been his alone. And the more his boy leaned toward her, the more the billionaire's control unraveled. The waitress didn't notice at first. She had long learned to ignore the heavy gaze of men in suits, though his stare carried something sharper, something that unsettled her. She focused on the boy, steadying his hands, cutting his food into smaller bites, brushing away the frustration on his face when his fork slipped. She whispered encouragement, words soft and careful, and he looked at her with a warmth he had never given his father. That was the breaking point. The billionaire's hand trembled as he set down his cup. His breathing grew shallow, his mind roaring with thoughts he couldn't quiet. He felt invisible, powerless, reduced to an observer in his own son's life. Rage swelled in his chest until it felt like it might split him open. In that moment, everything he had ever built, his empire, his wealth, his name, meant nothing. He was a man eclipsed by a stranger in a diner. It happened. Fast, but to those involved, it felt stretched, as though time had slowed into unbearable fragments. He rose suddenly, the movement startling the waitress and his son. His voice, low and sharp, cut through the quiet hum of the diner as he accused her of trying to replace him, of stealing what was his. The waitress froze, her face pale, words stuck in her throat. The boy's eyes widened, confusion turning to fear. She tried to calm him, to explain, but his fury drowned everything out. His hands shook as he grabbed at her arm, pulling her away from the booth. She stumbled, the tray she had been carrying clattering to the floor, silverware scattering across the tiles. Customers turned their heads, startled, but no one moved. The boy cried out, his voice breaking with panic, but his father's anger had broken free of restraint. The sound of the struggle filled the diner. The waitress pleaded, her voice trembling, telling him to stop, that he was hurting her. But in his mind, the lines had blurred. She wasn't just a waitress, she was the thief of his son's love, the embodiment of every loss and humiliation he had buried. His grip tightened, his body towering over her as she fought to free herself. Plates shattered, chairs scraped against the floor. The boy screamed for him to stop, but the billionaire's rage was deafening. And then it happened, the moment that could never be undone. In the chaos, his hands moved from holding to striking, from restraint to violence. The sound of the impact cracked through the room, followed by a silence so sharp it seemed to erase every other noise. The waitress crumpled, her body hitting the tile with a thud that echoed in the stunned stillness. Her eyes fluttered, her breath shallow, her face pale against the cold floor. The boy sobbed, reaching toward her, his small hands trembling uncontrollably. The billionaire stood frozen, chest heaving, staring at what he had done. For a fleeting second, regret flickered across his face, but it was buried quickly beneath shock and denial. He looked around, his gaze darting to the silent customers, their faces pale, their bodies glued to their seats. He realized with dawning horror that he wasn't in his boardroom, wasn't in his empire of power and fear. He was just a man who had crossed an irreversible line in front of witnesses. Panic surged. He dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering, unsure whether to help her up or hide what he had done. He muttered to himself, fragments of sentences. She pushed me. She made me do it. She was trying to take him from me. His voice was wild, desperate, as if saying the words could rewrite reality. The boy's cries filled the diner, sharp and heartbreaking, his pleas shaking the air. He begged his father to stop, begged him to help her, but the billionaire couldn't hear. His mind was already splintering between fear of what he had done and the instinct to control the damage. He looked at his son, his eyes hollow, and for the first time, the boy recoiled from him in terror. The waitress lay still, her shallow breaths fading into silence, the life slipping from her as the diner remained paralyzed. The rain outside pounded harder, thunder booming, as if the night itself was bearing witness. Inside, the air grew heavy with the stench of violence, the metallic scent of blood mixing with grease and coffee. In that moment, the billionaire wasn't a man of wealth or power. He wasn't a father, or even a protector. He was a criminal, exposed in the harsh neon lights of a cheap diner, his empire crumbling around him before the world even knew. The diner never looked the same after that night. Police tape fluttered in the rain, sealing off the place where laughter, small talk, and the smell of fried food had once filled the air. Reporters swarmed outside, their voices sharp and urgent, lights flashing against the wet glass. Strangers pressed close to the windows, their faces pale with curiosity and horror, trying to glimpse the crime scene that was already becoming a headline. Inside, the floor still bore the dark stain of what had happened, a silent reminder of a life cut short in a burst of violence. The billionaire was taken out in handcuffs, his tailored suit soaked with rain, his face pale and unreadable under the glare of cameras. For years, he had built an image of control, power, and dignity, but in that moment, he looked like any other man caught in his worst act. His son's cries echoed behind him, the boy trembling in the arms of a paramedic, calling out for the waitress who could no longer answer. That sound haunted every witness. In the days that followed, the billionaire shifted between denial and justification. In the interrogation room, his words came in fragments. He said he hadn't meant to hurt her, that she provoked him, that she had been trying to steal his son's love. He told himself he had only lost control for a moment, that the world wouldn't see him as a criminal, but as a father pushed to the edge. But beneath his rehearsed words, fear leaked through. Fear of a trial, of prison, of losing everything he had built. He convinced himself that money and influence would protect him, as they always had. The boy's world collapsed in silence. He refused to speak for days, his small frame shaking with grief he didn't know how to carry. The one person who had seen him, who had treated him with patience and kindness, was gone. And the man he had once looked up to, the only parent left in his life, had become a figure of terror. He recoiled whenever his father's name was mentioned, his heart twisting with confusion. How could the man who gave him everything also be the one who destroyed the only thing that made him feel alive? His disability made him dependent, yet emotionally, he had never felt more alone. The waitress's death rippled through the community. Regular customers who had shared jokes with her, who had found comfort in her small acts of kindness, now sat at the counter in stunned silence. To them, she had been more than just someone who carried plates. She had been part of their lives, a presence that made their weary nights easier. Her co-workers wept quietly as they worked, haunted by the memory of her final moments. They had all seen how she treated the boy, how natural her care had been, and they couldn't understand how something so gentle had ended in violence so cruel. Her family, already burdened by hardship, was thrown into chaos. Bills piled higher, debts grew heavier, and now, Grief cut through every conversation. They struggled to reconcile their memories of her, hard-working, selfless, always carrying more than her share, with the brutal way her life had ended. Their pain was amplified by the knowledge that her story was now being told through headlines, her identity reduced to waitress killed in billionaire crime. The media fed on the story. News anchors spoke of the shocking downfall of a man once admired for his wealth and power. Headlines screamed of obsession, violence, and betrayal. Some painted him as a monster, a man so consumed by control that he destroyed the one person who showed his son kindness. Others tried to soften the narrative, hinting at pressure, at stress, at a moment of madness. But no matter how it was spun, the image of him in handcuffs, soaked and broken under flashing lights, marked the end of his reputation. His empire began to crumble. Investors fled, partnerships dissolved, and lawsuits multiplied. His name, once spoken with awe in boardrooms, became a curse whispered in disgust. His allies turned their backs, eager to distance themselves from the scandal. The power he had spent a lifetime building collapsed faster than he could have imagined, leaving him isolated, his wealth unable to shield him from the weight of justice. In court, the atmosphere was heavy. The boy, too fragile to testify, was represented by caregivers who described his trauma, his sleepless nights, his sudden silence. Witnesses from the diner spoke through tears of what they had seen: the waitress's kindness, the billionaire's rage, the sound of her body hitting the floor. The defense tried to paint it as an accident, a moment of lost control, but the evidence was unshakable. He hadn't just lost control, he had chosen violence. For the billionaire, the hardest blow wasn't the trial, or even the looming sentence. It was the look in his son's eyes when they finally met again. There was no affection there, no longing, only fear and sorrow. In that gaze, he saw the truth. He had lost the one person he had claimed to be fighting for. No amount of money, no argument in court could repair that. The city carried the story like a scar. People whispered of the crime as a lesson, about the fragility of power, the danger of control, the way wealth could not shield a man from the simplest truths of humanity. For the customers of the diner, for the family of the waitress, and for the boy left behind, the tragedy lived on, not just as a crime, but as a wound that would never fully heal. The aftermath revealed the truth behind all the masks. The billionaire was no longer untouchable. The waitress was no longer invisible. And the boy, caught in between, was left to carry both the loss of love and the shadow of violence for the rest of his life. The trial ended with the weight of inevitability. The jury deliberated for less than a day, their decision unanimous. The billionaire was found guilty of manslaughter, his wealth and influence powerless against the clear testimonies and the undeniable presence of witnesses who had seen the act unfold in real time. The judge, firm and unshaken by the defense's attempts to soften the crime, handed down a sentence that stripped away the man's freedom. For the first time in decades, he no longer had control, not of his son, not of his image, not of his future. In prison, the trappings of his former life meant nothing. The tailored suits, the penthouse view, the golden watch, those were all gone. He became just another man in grey, another number in a long line of broken men. Yet the punishment was more than walls and bars. The true sentence lay in his memories. Night after night, he replayed the sound of his son's cries, the sight of the waitress collapsing under his hands, the silence that followed. No wealth could soften that weight. He carried it alone, and for once, he could not buy forgiveness. The boy, too, was forever changed. He was placed under the care of relatives and professionals, his father's rights stripped away. He lived in a quieter world now, one where people spoke softly around him, tiptoeing through his pain. His disability already made his life fragile, but now he bore an invisible wound that no therapy could fully heal. The one person who had given him comfort in his darkest moments was gone. The other, the man he had trusted, his father, had become the source of his nightmares. For him, justice did not feel like victory. It felt like survival, hollow and heavy. The waitress's family mourned with a grief sharpened by injustice. Yes, the man who killed her was behind bars. But what comfort was there in that when her chair at the dinner table remained empty? She had been their hope, the one who worked long shifts to send money home, who sacrificed her dreams to keep the family afloat. Now they were left with debts, with silence, with a loss that no court ruling could repair. For them, justice was only partial, a bandage over a wound that would never fully close. The community around the diner changed too. Customers who had once laughed with her now spoke in hushed tones, remembering her smile with a sorrow that lingered. The diner itself carried a shadow. The red vinyl booths and chrome stools no longer just symbols of comfort, but reminders of how quickly violence can pierce ordinary life. For those who worked there, every shift became a balancing act between moving forward and carrying the memory of their co-worker who never came back. Society at large was forced to confront uncomfortable truths. The story spread far beyond the city, covered in newspapers, dissected on talk shows, and debated online. It raised questions about power and justice. How often men like him had walked away unscathed, protected by money and influence, and whether this case marked a turning point. Some argued it was proof that justice could be blind, that even the richest man could not escape the law. Others were less hopeful, pointing out that it took dozens of witnesses, a public setting, and overwhelming evidence to finally hold him accountable. How many others had escaped responsibility because their crimes happened in shadows, where no one dared speak? The case became more than just one man's downfall. It exposed the fragility of human morality, the way love could twist into possession, how control could rot into violence. The billionaire had not killed out of need or survival. He had killed out of pride, jealousy, and fear of being replaced. His crime revealed how power without humility corrodes, how wealth without empathy isolates. It forced people to reflect on the dangerous belief that affection can be bought or forced, when in truth, love can only be given freely. At its core, the story was not only about crime, but about the complexity of human behavior. A father who loved his son but could not bear the vulnerability of that love. A boy who longed to be seen, who found comfort in kindness that came without expectation. A woman who gave without asking, who lost her life because someone mistook her compassion for a threat. Their lives collided in one moment of violence, and nothing could undo it. The public backlash against the billionaire was swift and merciless. Once celebrated as a titan of industry, he was now remembered only for his crime. His name became synonymous with arrogance and downfall, his empire a cautionary tale whispered in business schools and boardrooms. Yet beneath the spectacle of his fall lay the quieter tragedy. The boy left behind, the family robbed of their daughter, the community scarred. Those were the true costs, the ones no headline could fully capture. In the end, justice was served in the legal sense. The billionaire faced consequences. The waitress's family saw him punished. The boy was given safety away from his father's shadow. But justice in life is never complete. It does not restore laughter to a child, or bring back a daughter, or erase the fear that lingers after violence. It can only draw a line, however faint, between right and wrong, and remind society of the cost when that line is crossed. This story, like so many others, left behind lessons that were easy to name but hard to live by. That power should never outweigh compassion. That control is not love. That the most fragile lives, those of children, of the working poor, of the unseen, are often the ones most at risk when pride turns violent. The diner, the courtroom, the headlines. They became mirrors, reflecting those truths back at a society that often forgets them. As time passed, people moved on, as they always do. The media found new scandals, new crimes, new stories to feed on. The world turned, the rain fell, and the city lights glowed just as they had before. But for those who had lived it, the boy, the family, the witnesses, the story never ended. It lived in them, in their grief, in their resilience, in the small ways they tried to rebuild. And maybe that was the truest conclusion. That behind every crime, beyond every headline, there are lives forever changed, carrying a weight the world will never fully see,